The Mummy, 2017, a comprehensive film analysis and explanation. The Mummy, 2017, serves as a foundational text for examining the modern blockbuster's relationship with franchise building, standing as a primary example of ambition outpacing execution. This analysis will explore the film's narrative structure, character development, thematic concerns, production history, and ultimate legacy as a cautionary tale in Hollywood. This comprehensive analysis and explanation begins by examining the film's intended role as the cornerstone of Universal's Dark Universe, a shared cinematic universe designed to rival the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The film is burdened from its opening scenes by the weight of these corporate aspirations, constantly signaling towards a larger world rather than establishing its own identity. The consequence of this approach is a narrative that feels less like a self-contained story and more like an extended trailer for future installments, a decision that critically undermined audience engagement. A detailed analysis of the plot reimagines the origin of the classic monster through the lens of Princess Ahmanet. The prologue in ancient Egypt efficiently establishes Ahmanet as a tragic figure whose ambition for power leads her to make a pact with the god of death, Set. The ritual, involving a ceremonial dagger and a human sacrifice, is visually striking, setting the stage for the supernatural elements that will plague the modern-day narrative. This backstory immediately differentiates Ahmanet from previous cinematic mummies, framing her not as a cursed priest, but as a power-hungry princess. An analysis of its contemporary setting introduces Nick Morton and Chris Vail, two U.S. Army sergeants operating as opportunistic antiquities looters in war-torn Iraq. Their morally dubious profession is meant to establish Nick as a roguish anti-hero, a departure from the clear-cut heroes Tom Cruise typically portrays. The film attempts to ground its fantasy elements in a recognizably gritty, modern conflict, creating a jarring contrast between the realistic warfare and the impending supernatural chaos. This juxtaposition, however, is one of the film's more intriguing, if underdeveloped, conceptual choices. A thorough analysis of the accidental discovery of Ahmanet's tomb reveals a moment triggered by a firefight between Nick's unit and insurgents. This discovery is pure chance, underscoring Nick's lack of heroic intention. He is not a scholar or an adventurer like previous incarnations of the franchise's heroes, but a looter in the right place at the wrong time. The introduction of archaeologist Jenny Halsey at this point adds a layer of scientific legitimacy, though her dynamic with Nick is immediately framed by their past, hinted at romantic history. An analysis of the pivotal plane crash sequence, a centerpiece of the film's marketing, demonstrates its commitment to practical effects. Ahmanet's curse manifests, unleashing a massive flock of crows to bring down the military transport carrying her sarcophagus. The sequence is chaotic and intense, showcasing the film's action pedigree. However, from an analytical perspective, it also represents a key turning point where the curse directly intervenes, setting the stage for Nick's direct involvement with the supernatural. An analysis of Nick Morton's character arc truly begins in the aftermath of the plane crash. His survival comes at the cost of his friend Chris's life after Nick is forced to kill the possessed Vale. Waking in a morgue, Nick is haunted by Chris's ghost, a narrative device borrowed from horror classics like An American Werewolf in London. This moment solidifies his cursed status. He is now marked by Ahmanet, who sees him as the chosen vessel for Set. An analysis of Sofia Boutella's performance as Princess Ahmanet is widely regarded as one of the film's strongest elements. Boutella uses her background as a dancer to create a physically imposing and eerily graceful monster. Her movements are fluid and predatory, a stark contrast to the shambling, bandage-wrapped iterations of the past. The character's design, with its intricate tattoos and dual-pupiled eyes, is a creative high point, even if the writing surrounding her character falters. A critical analysis of how Ahmanet's powers are depicted establishes the rules for her regeneration. Her need to absorb the life force of living humans to restore her decomposed form is clearly shown. The visual effects used for these sequences are a mixed bag, with some moments of genuine horror as she drains her victims, leaving them desiccated husks. This aspect of the film leans into the darker, more monstrous territory that the original Universal horrors explored. An analysis of the introduction of Prodigium and Dr. Henry Jekyll represents the film's most overt pivot towards franchise building. The rescue of Nick and Jenny by this secret organization feels less like a narrative progression and more like a corporate mandate. Russell Crowe's Dr. Jekyll is positioned as a Nick Fury-esque figure, leading a centuries-old organization dedicated to hunting and studying monsters, a clear setup for future films. An analysis of Russell Crowe's dual performance as Jekyll and his monstrous alter ego, Mr. Hyde, reveals a tonal misfire. The transformation into Hyde relies heavily on CGI and feels disconnected from the film's established aesthetic. The scene is meant to demonstrate the power and danger of the monsters Prodigium contains, but instead, it devolves into a chaotic brawl that adds little to the central plot and serves primarily to introduce another Dark Universe character. An analysis of Dr. Jekyll's plan to allow Set to possess Nick in a controlled environment points out the logical flaws in this scheme. It underestimates the power of an ancient Egyptian god and the cunning of Ahmanet. The plan feels like a plot contrivance designed to bring Nick, Jenny, and Ahmanet together in the Prodigium facility, setting the stage for an inevitable escape and a final confrontation in London. A detailed analysis of the final act unfolds in the streets of modern-day London. Ahmanet's retrieval of the ruby from a Crusader tomb beneath the city and her subsequent unleashing of an army of undead knights are key events. The imagery of ancient skeletal warriors riding horses through contemporary London is visually ambitious, echoing similar scenes in other blockbusters, but lacking the same narrative weight or emotional impact. An analysis of the climax reveals Ahmanet killing Jenny to sever Nick's last human connection. This act of villainy is intended to be the catalyst for Nick's ultimate sacrifice and transformation. In a moment of desperation, Nick chooses to stab himself with the dagger of Set, inviting the god to possess him. This choice is presented as both an act of self-sacrifice and a surrender to the curse that has been following him. A character analysis of this pivotal transformation shows Nick, possessed by Set, gaining immense power. The internal struggle that follows as Nick's love for Jenny, even in death, allows him to reassert control over the god's will, is crucial. This moment subverts Ahmanet's plan and positions Nick as a new kind of monster, one who can wield the power of Set while maintaining his humanity. An analysis of the film's controversial ending sees Nick using Set's power to resurrect Jenny. This act undercuts the emotional stakes of her death, making her sacrifice feel temporary and cheap. The resurrection, fueled by Nick's newfound godlike abilities, is a deus ex machina that prioritizes a happy ending over a thematically resonant or tragic one. It reinforces the idea that in this universe, death is merely an inconvenience. An analysis of its final scene sees Nick resurrecting his friend Chris Vale in the desert. This moment is a full embrace of Nick's new anti-hero status. He is no longer a soldier or a looter, but a being of immense power, now hunted by the very organization that sought to control him. The scene is a blatant sequel hook, suggesting a future where Nick and Chris operate as rogue supernatural entities. An analysis of Tom Cruise's performance is a subject of much critical debate. His signature intensity and commitment to practical stunts are both an asset and a hindrance. While he sells the physicality of the action sequences, his established movie star persona clashes with the film's attempts to paint Nick Morton as a selfish, morally ambiguous character. The audience never fully believes in his roguishness because he is so indelibly Tom Cruise, the hero. A critical analysis of Annabelle Wallis's character, Jenny Halsey, finds her widely considered underwritten. Her primary function in the narrative is to be a conduit for exposition, a love interest for Nick, and a damsel in distress. Despite being positioned as a knowledgeable archaeologist, her agency is consistently undermined, and her character arc is entirely dependent on Nick's actions, reflecting a regressive gender dynamic. An analysis of Jake Johnson's role as Chris Vale provides some of the film's only moments of levity. His comedic timing is a welcome relief from the film's otherwise dour tone. Even after his character's death, his ghostly appearances offer a glimpse of the more self-aware, horror-comedy hybrid the film could have been, serving as a constant, sardonic reminder of Nick's cursed predicament. An analysis of its tonal inconsistencies reveals a major point of critical contention. The film struggles to balance action, horror, and comedy. It wants the swashbuckling adventure of the 1999 The Mummy, the body horror of a classic monster movie, and the quippy humor of a modern Marvel film. The result is a jarring and often confusing experience that never commits fully to any one genre. A thematic analysis explores its examination of ancient evil colliding with the modern world. The film uses iconic London locations, such as the Natural History Museum and the streets of the city, as a backdrop for its supernatural chaos. The contrast between the ancient, mystical dagger and the high-tech labs of Prodigium is meant to highlight this clash, but the film never delves deeply into the philosophical implications. An analysis of its production history reveals a classic example of development hell. The project languished for years after the release of The Mummy, Tomb of the Dragon Emperor in 2008. The studio's initial desire to continue with the existing cast gave way to a decision to reboot, leading to numerous writers and directors being attached before a final vision, or lack thereof, coalesced. An analysis of the early creative struggles, particularly the departure of director Andy Muschietti, is revealing. Muschietti, who later found success with it, envisioned a darker, more horror-centric take on the material. His exit over creative differences with the studio, which favored a more family-friendly action-adventure approach, is a crucial piece of information that foreshadows the tonal problems of the final film. An analysis of how the hiring of John Spates, known for his work on Prometheus, signaled an initial intent to create a darker, more cerebral science fiction/horror hybrid. His original vision was likely far more somber and kung bu than what ultimately made it to the screen. The final film retains traces of this darker DNA, but buries them under layers of blockbuster spectacle and franchise connectivity. An analysis of the decision to bring in Alex Kurtzman and Chris Morgan to oversee the Dark Universe frames this moment as the point where the film's identity as a standalone project was truly sacrificed. Kurtzman and Morgan were tasked with building a shared universe, and this film became the vehicle for that ambition, rather than a story conceived and executed on its own terms. An analysis of its screenplay, which boasts a lengthy list of credited writers, including David Koepp, Christopher McQuarrie, and Dylan Kussman, is telling. Such a crowded writing room is often a sign of a troubled production, where numerous voices and competing visions are stitched together. The final product feels written by committee, lacking a singular, cohesive creative voice. An analysis of its critical reception reveals it was overwhelmingly negative upon release. Its abysmal Rotten Tomatoes score of around 15 to 16% reflects critics universally panning its messy plot, tonal inconsistencies, and transparent franchise building. The critical consensus describing it as a mess of bones, bandages, and bald commercial cynicism perfectly encapsulates the general sentiment. An analysis of the specific criticisms leveled by major outlets like Variety and RogerEbert.com details how these reviews pointed to the film's failure as a standalone story, its underdeveloped characters, and its misguided reliance on setting up future installments. The critics argued that the film was less concerned with its own plot and more interested in introducing the audience to the wider, dark universe. An analysis of the box office performance, which, while grossing $410 million worldwide against a $125 to $195 million budget, was considered a financial failure, is instructive. The economics of blockbuster filmmaking mean the production budget is only half the story. The massive marketing and distribution costs meant the film needed to earn significantly more to be profitable, ultimately leading to an estimated $60 to $95 million loss for the studio. An analysis of its legacy as a cautionary tale within the film industry explores how its failure became a case study in what happens when studios prioritize building a universe over telling a good story. It serves as a stark warning to other studios attempting to launch their own interconnected franchises, demonstrating that audiences will reject a film that feels more like a corporate product than a piece of art. An analysis of its impact on the Dark Universe, which was effectively cancelled in the wake of its poor performance, is crucial. Planned films centered on The Bride of Frankenstein, The Wolf Man, and The Invisible Man were all shelved. The dream of a monster-sized shared universe crumbled under the weight of its poorly conceived foundation. An analysis of how the film compares to its predecessors, particularly the beloved 1999 version starring Brendan Fraser, highlights the key differences in tone and character. The 1999 film embraced its B-movie roots with a sense of fun and adventure, while this reboot takes itself far too seriously, mistaking grimness for depth and failing to replicate the charismatic chemistry of its cast. An analysis of its connection to the 1932 original classic, which starred Boris Karloff, explores how the film attempts to pay homage to its roots by incorporating elements of horror and the idea of a cursed, ancient being. However, it misses the slow-burn, atmospheric terror of the original, replacing it with loud, CGI-driven spectacle. An analysis of its visual effects reveals a point of contention. While some effects, such as the design of Ahmanet and the skeletal crusaders, are impressive, others, like the fully CGI-rendered sandstorms and the transformation into Mr. Hyde, look cartoonish and unconvincing. The reliance on CGI detracts from the tangible, practical horror that made the classic monster movies so effective. An analysis of the film's action sequences shows they are undeniably a product of Tom Cruise's involvement. The plane crash and the zero-gravity sequence within it stand out as a set piece, demonstrating the actor's famous commitment to practical stunts. However, the other action scenes, such as the car chase in London and the final showdown, feel generic and lack the inventive choreography of better action films. An analysis of its sound design and musical score examines how the film uses sound to build tension, particularly in scenes involving Ahmanet's approach or the swarming crows. The score, while functional, is forgettable, failing to create a memorable musical identity for the film or its characters, a stark contrast to the iconic themes of the Universal monsters of old. An analysis of its marketing campaign, which heavily featured the promise of a new cinematic universe, is revealing. The trailers showcased the Dark Universe logo and highlighted Russell Crowe's Dr. Jekyll, inadvertently telegraphing the film's biggest weakness. The marketing promised a sprawling world, but failed to convince audiences that the core story was worth investing in. An analysis of the character of Dr. Jekyll's motivations reveals they are muddled by his own internal struggle. His use of a serum to control his Hyde personality adds a layer of tension to his scenes. However, this internal conflict is never fully integrated into the main plot, serving more as a character trait for a future spin-off than a relevant element of the current story. An analysis of the Dagger of Set as a MacGuffin explains that it is an object which drives the plot, but has little inherent meaning. The ruby and the dagger are separated for centuries, and the entire film revolves around reuniting them to complete Ahmanet's ritual. While functional as a plot device, the dagger lacks the symbolic resonance or cultural significance that could have enriched the story. An analysis of the Prodigium organization and its vast collection of monster-related artifacts views the scenes set in their London headquarters as a tour of future franchise possibilities. The brief glimpses of other artifacts, hinting at the existence of other monsters, are the film's most blatant form of world-building, treating the audience to a museum of things they could see in other movies, if only they support this one. An analysis of its depiction of ancient Egyptian mythology shows significant liberties taken for the sake of the story. The film simplifies and reinterprets the god Set, transforming him from a complex deity of chaos, storms, and violence into a one-dimensional force of pure evil whose sole goal is to be incarnated. This creative choice prioritizes a simple villainous motive over mythological accuracy or depth. An analysis of its modern-day setting in Iraq and London explores how the choice to begin in a war zone is an attempt to inject a sense of gritty realism, but it ultimately feels like a superficial backdrop. The transition to London, with its foggy streets and ancient history, is more thematically appropriate for a gothic horror story, yet the film fails to fully exploit the atmospheric potential of either location. An analysis of the film's central relationship between Nick and Jenny finds it widely criticized for lacking chemistry. Their romantic connection is based entirely on exposition about a past affair, rather than any compelling interaction in the present. The audience is told they have history, but they are never shown why they should care about their future. An analysis of how the film attempts to handle the theme of fate versus choice delves into Nick's destiny to be the vessel for Set, a fate he actively tries to avoid. His ultimate choice to embrace the possession is framed as an act of free will, a decision made out of love and desperation. However, this thematic thread is undercut by the film's chaotic plotting and lack of character development. An analysis of its supporting cast, which includes notable actors like Courtney B. Vance as a U.S. Secretary of Defense, notes that these characters are introduced only to be quickly dispatched. They serve as fodder for Ahmanet's regeneration, or as bystanders to the main action. Their presence underscores the film's narrow focus on its central trio, to the detriment of a richer narrative world. An analysis of the film's humor, which is mostly relegated to Jake Johnson's character, both alive and dead, evaluates its effectiveness. It provides a necessary counterbalance to the film's otherwise grim tone. However, it also creates a jarring tonal shift, as the film cuts from scenes of horrific body horror to Johnson's sarcastic, ghostly quips. An analysis of its pacing reveals struggles in the middle act. The film drags during the extended sequences within the Prodigium facility, where characters engage in lengthy exposition dumps about the dark universe and the history of monsters. These scenes grind the narrative momentum to a halt, prioritizing information over action or character development. An analysis of its final confrontation shows it lacks a satisfying physical or emotional climax. The CGI-heavy battle between a possessed Nick and Ahmanet devolves into a blur of sand and smoke. The resolution, where Nick simply drains her life force, feels anticlimactic and robs the audience of a more personal, character-driven victory. An analysis of its post-credits scene, or lack thereof, notes a notable omission given the era's blockbuster trends. The film's sequel hooks were so blatantly woven into its main narrative that a post-credits scene was deemed unnecessary. Nick's final resurrection of Vale and their departure into the desert is the post-credits scene, embedded into the film's conclusion. An analysis of its costume design, particularly for Princess Ahmanet, praises the intricate and evocative costumes that blend ancient Egyptian aesthetics with a monstrous, otherworldly quality. Her gradual transformation from a desiccated corpse to a regenerated, powerful entity is reflected in her evolving appearance, a detail that demonstrates thoughtful design work amidst the film's many flaws. An analysis of its cinematography reveals some striking images, but a lack of consistent visual language. The sweeping shots of the Iraqi desert and the claustrophobic interior of the crashed plane are visually effective moments. However, the film's overall look is generic, failing to establish a unique visual identity that would distinguish it from other action-adventure films. An analysis of the film's approach to horror shows it is ultimately too tame to satisfy genre fans. While there are moments of body horror, such as the spider bite possession and the draining of life force, the film consistently pulls back from true terror. It opts for jump scares and creepy imagery rather than building sustained dread, a choice that leaves it in a no-man's land between horror film and action movie. An analysis of its underlying message about power and its corruption examines Ahmanet's initial desire for power, which leads to her damnation, and Nick's eventual acquisition of power, which he uses for selfless purposes. The film seems to suggest that power itself is neutral, and its morality is determined by the user's intent. However, this theme is explored superficially, buried under the weight of spectacle. An analysis of the character of Mr. Hyde reveals his brief appearance is more of a showcase for CGI than a meaningful exploration of the classic duality. The film reduces one of literature's most complex characters to a generic, rage-filled monster. The intellectual and psychological horror of Jekyll and Hyde is completely abandoned in favor of a loud, visually chaotic brawl. An analysis of its place within Tom Cruise's filmography identifies it as one of his few major misfires. Cruise's producing influence and star power were unable to salvage the project. The film stands as an anomaly in a career largely defined by commercial success, demonstrating that even the biggest stars can't guarantee a hit when the underlying creative foundation is unsound. An analysis of its soundtrack and the use of licensed music notes the use of contemporary songs in the film's marketing, but within the film itself, the score dominates. The lack of a memorable song or musical motif further contributes to the film's generic and forgettable identity in the years since its release. An analysis of its attempt to create a new kind of monster movie anti-hero in Nick Morton evaluates whether this attempt is successful, concluding that it is not. Nick's transition from selfish looter to self-sacrificing hero is too abrupt and lacks the necessary character development to be convincing. He remains a hollow archetype rather than a fully realized person. An analysis of how the film handles the concept of a curse examines the mechanics of Ahmanet's curse, which binds Nick to her and marks him as her chosen one. The curse is presented as an inescapable force of destiny, yet the film's ending, with Nick mastering Set's power, suggests it can be overcome through sheer force of will, a contradiction that further muddles the film's internal logic. An analysis of its production design for the ancient Egyptian tomb and the Prodigium headquarters contrasts the dusty, ancient aesthetic of the tomb, filled with intricate hieroglyphs and traps, with the sleek, modern, and sterile environment of the monster hunting organization. This visual dichotomy is one of the film's more successful elements, effectively representing the clash between the ancient and the modern. An analysis of its critical failure as a death knell for the dark universe concept details how the film's negative reception and box office losses prompted an immediate and total reassessment of Universal's strategy. The studio pivoted away from interconnected blockbusters, later finding success with standalone, auteur-driven projects like The Invisible Man, 2020, which proved that the monsters themselves were not the problem. An analysis of its legacy on streaming services, where it has found a somewhat kinder reception, notes that on platforms like Netflix, particularly around Halloween, the film is often watched and dismissed as a piece of background entertainment. Its availability has allowed it to be rediscovered not as a theatrical failure, but as a curiosity, a big-budget oddity that serves as a snapshot of a particular, failed moment in Hollywood history. An analysis of the film's editing reveals it contributes to its chaotic and disjointed feel. Scenes often feel truncated, and transitions between the film's different tones, horror, action, comedy, are abrupt and jarring. The editing fails to create a smooth narrative flow, leaving the audience feeling disoriented rather than engaged. An analysis of its world building, its most notorious feature, dissects how every element of the film, from Dr. Jekyll's introduction to the artifacts in Prodigium's vault, is designed to point towards something else. This relentless focus on the future leaves the present story feeling hollow and unimportant, as if the film itself is impatient to get to the sequels it will never have. An analysis of the film's treatment of its villain, Ahmanet, explores the criticism that her power is sexualized and ultimately contained by the male hero. While Batella's performance is menacing, the narrative reduces her primary motivation, to bring her lover back and rule with Set, to a function of her sexuality, a creative choice that undermined the potential for a truly great female monster. An analysis of the film's failure to learn from the successful shared universe model it sought to emulate points out that the Marvel Cinematic Universe succeeded by first making great individual movies that happened to be connected. This film attempted to do the reverse, building the connections first and hoping a movie would materialize around them. This fundamental misunderstanding of its source of inspiration was its fatal flaw. An analysis of its action climax in London draws inevitable comparisons to other films that have destroyed iconic landmarks. The sight of a giant sandstorm engulfing London and skeletons rampaging through the streets feels derivative, lacking the originality or emotional stakes of similar scenes in films like Ghostbusters or The Avengers. It is spectacle for its own sake. An analysis of the character of Nick Morton's morality, which is presented as flexible from the outset, examines his looting of antiquities and his willingness to sell Jenny out for his own gain. This moral ambiguity is a bold choice for a Tom Cruise character, but the film never commits to it, ultimately redeeming him through a love story that feels unearned. An analysis of its use of Egyptian iconography reveals it is often reduced to simplistic symbols of death and evil. The film leans into Orientalist tropes, presenting an ancient, mystical, and dangerous East clashing with a rational, modern West. This reductive framing is a missed opportunity to engage with the richness of Egyptian culture and mythology in a more respectful and nuanced way. An analysis of its attempt to create a romantic subplot, further hampered by the lack of chemistry between Cruise and Wallace, suggests the film would have been better served by focusing on the strange, parasitic bond between Nick and Ahmanet. That relationship is far more unique and interesting than the generic romance that takes center stage. An analysis of the film's opening scene in ancient Egypt identifies it as its most effective sequence in terms of establishing mood and stakes. The sequence's visual storytelling efficiently conveys Ahmanet's betrayal, her pact with Set, and her horrific mummification. It is a shame that the film never again reaches this level of focused, atmospheric storytelling. An analysis of the character of Chris Vale's ghost, who functions as a sort of conscience for Nick, explores how Vale's sardonic commentary on Nick's situation provides a metatextual critique of the film itself. His presence is a reminder of the horror comedy the film could have been, and his eventual resurrection in the final scene suggests a future of wisecracking, monster-fueled adventures. An analysis of the film's central failure, its inability to make the audience care, argues that despite the high budget, the talented cast, and the action set pieces, the film lacks an emotional core. The characters are thinly drawn, the romance is unconvincing, and the stakes feel manufactured. Without an emotional connection to the characters, the spectacle rings hollow. An analysis of the film's themes of immortality and legacy explores how both Ahmanet and Nick seek a form of immortality. Ahmanet through the god Set, and Nick through his heroic deeds and cursed existence. Their conflict is, on a thematic level, a battle over what kind of legacy they will leave behind, a theme that is never given the depth it deserves. An analysis of its marketing materials, which prominently featured Tom Cruise running, notes, with a hint of irony, that the film's poster and trailers capitalized on Cruise's most iconic action movie trope. While the film delivers on this promise with several running sequences, it fails to deliver on the promise of a compelling story to run through. An analysis of its place in the long history of the Mummy franchise, which began in 1932, views this film as an outlier, a failed experiment that interrupted a lineage that includes comedic sequels and the beloved Brendan Fraser adventures. It is a film that will likely be remembered as a footnote in the franchise's history, a cautionary tale rather than a beloved entry. An analysis of the film's screenplay structure, which follows a classic three-act format but fills it with hollow spectacle, breaks down the acts: the discovery of the tomb, the chase in London, and the final confrontation. While the structure is sound, the execution within each act is flawed, with poor pacing, underdeveloped characters, and a focus on world-building over storytelling. An analysis of its status as a cult film in reverse, a film that is watched not for its quality, but for its instructive failure, suggests that its legacy will be as a teaching tool in film schools and industry seminars. It is a perfect example of how not to launch a franchise, ensuring its place in Hollywood history for all the wrong reasons. An analysis of the film's attempt to blend the sensibilities of its various writers, from the horror leanings of John Spates to the blockbuster experience of Christopher McQuarrie, posits that the final product is a compromise that satisfies no one. The horror elements are neutered, the action is generic, and the humor is sparse, resulting in a bland, committee-approved final product. An analysis of its ending's ambiguity, which leaves Nick Morton's future wide open, discusses how he is now a being with the power of Set, a resurrected friend, and a target on his back from Prodigium. This open-ended conclusion is the film's final, desperate sequel hook, a plea for a continuation that will never come, leaving Nick's story permanently suspended in a state of potential. An analysis of the film's critical and commercial failure as a symptom of a larger industry trend connects its failure to the mid-2010s peak of universe-building mania. Studios scrambled to replicate Marvel's success without understanding the foundational work required. This film stands as the most prominent victim of this trend, a multi-million-dollar monument to corporate myopia. An analysis of the one area where it might be considered a success, as a piece of elaborate, expensive fan fiction, suggests that for viewers who are not invested in coherent storytelling or character development, the film offers a series of loosely connected, high-budget scenes featuring familiar monster iconography. It is a film that prioritizes references and callbacks over substance. An analysis of its role in the careers of those involved, particularly director Alex Kurtzman, notes that while Kurtzman has gone on to find significant success in television, the failure of this film effectively ended his prospects as a big-budget film director. The film remains a blemish on the resumes of nearly everyone associated with it, a testament to its toxic reputation. A final, comprehensive analysis of its overall significance concludes that the film is more important for what it represents than for what it is. It is a cultural artifact, a warning label for future generations of filmmakers. It demonstrates that star power, a beloved IP, and a massive budget are no substitute for a good script, well-developed characters, and a clear, singular creative vision. It is, in the end, a fascinating failure. This exploration of the film's narrative architecture reveals a fundamental tension between its desire to honor classic monster mythology and its obligation to deliver contemporary blockbuster spectacle, a balancing act that ultimately proves unsustainable throughout the runtime. The screenplay attempts to weave together disparate elements from adventure cinema, horror traditions, and superhero franchise conventions, creating a hybrid that satisfies neither genre's dedicated audience. The ancient Egyptian prologue establishes a visual language of grandeur and tragedy that the modern sequences struggle to replicate, suggesting a film uncertain whether its primary allegiance lies with Gothic horror or with Tom Cruise's trademark adrenaline-fueled heroism. This identity crisis manifests in every creative decision, from the casting to the marketing, leaving audiences confused about what kind of experience they are purchasing tickets to witness. The film's producers clearly hoped that Cruise's international star power would transcend these tonal inconsistencies, but his presence instead highlights the disconnect between the material's darker aspirations and his established screen persona. Meanwhile, the horror elements feel sanitized for a PG-13 audience, robbing the monster mythology of the visceral terror that made the original Universal classics enduring works of cinematic art. The action sequences, while competently executed, lack the inventive choreography and emotional stakes that distinguish memorable set pieces from disposable spectacle. This fundamental uncertainty about what the film wants to be when it grows up permeates every frame, creating a watching experience that is less engaging narrative and more academic exercise in identifying competing creative visions. The production's troubled history, with its revolving door of writers and directors, becomes visible in the finished product's jagged edges and narrative non-sequiturs. What emerges is a film that functions as a fascinating case study in how studio interference, franchise ambitions, and creative compromise can combine to produce something that is technically proficient yet artistically hollow. The finished product bears the scars of its difficult birth, with each creative decision seeming to second-guess the one that came before it. An examination of the film's sound design reveals a sophisticated audio landscape that often works at cross-purposes with the visual elements, creating a dissonance that further contributes to the viewer's sense of disorientation. The auditory palette ranges from the haunting, ancient-sounding chants accompanying Ahmanet's resurrection to the thunderous explosions and screeching metal of the plane crash sequence, each sonic element competently rendered, yet somehow failing to cohere into a unified auditory experience. The score, composed with obvious ambition, reaches for the epic grandeur of classic adventure films, but lands in a generic territory that could accompany almost any big-budget release from the same era. This musical indistinctness proves particularly damaging during moments intended to evoke horror, where specific, memorable themes have historically proven essential in building atmospheric dread and psychological tension. The sound effects team deserves recognition for their technical proficiency, crafting convincing audio for supernatural occurrences and practical stunts alike. Yet their work exists in isolation rather than as part of an integrated sensory experience. Dialogue scenes suffer from an odd acoustic flatness, as if recorded in different spaces and never quite blended into a consistent sonic environment. The film's most effective audio moment arrives during Ahmanet's initial awakening, where ancient Egyptian incantations blend with modern industrial sounds to create a genuinely unsettling atmosphere that the rest of the film fails to sustain. This brief glimpse of what might have been suggests that with clearer creative direction, the audio team could have crafted something truly distinctive and memorable. Instead, their work joins the film's other technically proficient elements in serving a narrative that never earns the audience's full investment. The sound mix during action sequences prioritizes impact over intelligibility, a common choice in modern blockbusters that leaves viewers feeling battered rather than engaged. Perhaps most disappointingly, the film misses the opportunity to develop sonic motifs for its various monsters and supernatural elements, leaving the auditory landscape as generic as its visual counterpart. A deeper analysis of Princess Ahmanet's characterization reveals a fascinating paradox. She is simultaneously the film's most compelling element and its most glaring example of missed potential, a character whose complexity is constantly suggested but never fully realized. The backstory establishes her as a figure of genuine tragedy, a princess denied her birthright by patriarchal succession laws who turns to dark forces out of understandable desperation rather than simple malice. This nuanced motivation, rare in blockbuster villainy, could have supported a narrative exploring themes of gender, power, and the corruption that comes from systemic injustice. Instead, the film gradually strips away this complexity, reducing Ahmanet to a more conventional monster whose primary function is to menace the hero and pursue her supernatural agenda. Sofia Boutella's committed physical performance constantly threatens to break through these limitations, her expressive movements and menacing presence suggesting depths the screenplay refuses to explore. The character's design evolves throughout the film in ways that visually communicate her growing power, a detail that demonstrates the costume and makeup department's understanding of her potential. Her interactions with Nick Morton oscillate between predatory pursuit and something approaching twisted intimacy, a dynamic that could have supported a more interesting film about the strange bonds formed between hunter and hunted. The decision to link her power so explicitly to sexuality reflects tired Hollywood conventions rather than anything organically emerging from the character's Egyptian mythology roots. When she finally meets her end at Nick's hands, the resolution feels less like a satisfying conclusion to her arc and more like the screenplay simply running out of ideas for what to do with her. The film's refusal to grant Ahmanet the same interiority it lavishes on its male protagonist represents a broader failure of imagination that limits the entire project. Future viewers may find themselves watching her scenes and imagining the better film she deserved, one that took her tragedy as seriously as it took Tom Cruise's star persona. The film's treatment of archaeological ethics and cultural heritage emerges as an unexpectedly rich area for critical examination, revealing how casually Hollywood can perpetuate problematic narratives about Western ownership of non-Western artifacts. Nick Morton's career as an antiquities looter is presented as roguish charm rather than the serious crime it actually represents, a framing that would be merely tone-deaf if it didn't reflect broader industry patterns. The Iraqi setting, still recovering from actual archaeological looting during the Iraq War, becomes merely exotic backdrop for adventure rather than a real place with living culture and legitimate claims to its own history. Jenny Halsey's position as an archaeologist ostensibly represents scientific legitimacy, yet her role largely involves facilitating the removal of Egyptian artifacts to London, a journey that echoes actual colonial-era acquisition practices. The film never questions whether ancient Egyptian remains belong in Egyptian hands, accepting as natural their transport to Western museums and secret organizations. Prodigium's collection of monster-related artifacts extends this logic into the supernatural realm, suggesting that the West's proper role is to discover, contain, and study the world's magical heritage. This colonial unconscious operates throughout the narrative without ever becoming visible to the filmmakers themselves, who likely never considered the political implications of their adventure premise. The Crusader tomb beneath London, containing the dagger's ruby, further reinforces this theme of Western ownership over Eastern power, suggesting that European history is the proper container for Egyptian magic. Modern Egypt appears only as a site of chaos and violence from which artifacts must be rescued, a framing that echoes centuries of Orientalist discourse about the Middle East. The film's complete disinterest in contemporary Egyptian people or culture reveals the limits of its world-building imagination, which extends only to monsters and heroes, never to ordinary human beings with their own relationships to ancient history. This political unconscious may explain why the film feels hollow despite its technical proficiency. It builds its fantasy on foundations of unexamined assumptions that limit what stories it can tell and whose perspectives it can take seriously. An examination of the film's visual effects pipeline reveals a production caught between practical ambition and digital necessity, resulting in a hybrid aesthetic that pleases neither purists nor modern audiences. The plane crash sequence, heavily promoted as a practical achievement with Tom Cruise genuinely experiencing zero-gravity conditions, represents the production at its most admirable, committing to tangible spectacle that digital effects can never quite replicate. Yet even this sequence required extensive digital augmentation to achieve its final form, creating a blend of real and artificial that sometimes reads as less impressive than either approach alone would have been. Ahmanet's transformations and supernatural abilities rely almost entirely on CGI, with results that range from the genuinely striking to the distractingly cartoonish. The skeletal Crusader army, when viewed in static shots, achieves a certain macabre grandeur, but in motion they lack the weight and physical presence that practical costumes might have provided. Mr. Hyde's transformation and subsequent rampage represents the film's low point in visual effects, with Russell Crowe's performance swallowed by unconvincing digital augmentation that undercuts any sense of genuine threat or horror. The sandstorm sequences, inevitable in any mummy movie, fail to achieve the tactile menace of similar scenes in superior films, remaining obviously digital constructions rather than immersive environmental threats. Interior shots of Prodigium's headquarters showcase the production design team's ambition, but the extensive digital set extension creates a slightly unreal quality that undermines the organization's supposed grounded reality. The film's color grading, aggressively teal and orange in the manner of its era, further flattens the visual experience, removing the textural richness that might have compensated for digital artificiality. Modern audiences have become sophisticated readers of visual effects quality, and this film's inconsistent digital work likely contributed to its negative reception among viewers who could see the seams. The practical effects that remain, including creature makeup and prosthetic work, are generally excellent, suggesting that a different creative approach might have yielded a more visually satisfying result. This tension between practical ambition and digital necessity reflects the broader production's inability to commit fully to any single creative vision, leaving every element slightly compromised. A critical analysis of Dr. Henry Jekyll's role in the narrative reveals a character whose primary function is not to serve the story, but to establish infrastructure for stories that will never be told, a creative choice that damages both the present film and the broader franchise it was meant to launch. Russell Crowe brings considerable presence and intelligence to the role, qualities that only highlight how little the screenplay gives him to do beyond deliver exposition and gesture toward future possibilities. The Jekyll and Hyde mythology, one of literature's richest explorations of human duality, is reduced to a CGI transformation and a convenient source of conflict during the film's middle section. Dr. Jekyll's organization, Prodigium, exists in a narrative vacuum, its rules, resources, and limitations never clearly established because the filmmakers assume future installments will fill in these details. His laboratory, filled with artifacts referencing other universal monsters, functions as a museum of future disappointments, each glimpsed item a reminder of movies that will never exist. The serum Jekyll uses to control his Hyde personality introduces a ticking clock element that the film forgets about whenever it becomes inconvenient, a classic example of plot mechanics overriding character consistency. His decision to allow Set to possess Nick in a controlled environment demonstrates either staggering arrogance or narrative convenience, depending on how generously one reads the scene. The eventual transformation into Hyde, meant to showcase the danger contained within Prodigium's leader, instead becomes a generic CGI battle that could feature any two monsters in any film. Crowe's performance suggests a more interesting version of this character, one whose centuries of monster hunting have left him morally compromised and psychologically damaged, but the film never explores these possibilities. The post-credits scene that never arrives would presumably have positioned Jekyll as a Nick Fury figure recruiting heroes for future adventures, a role for which the character is fundamentally unsuited given his own monstrous nature. In retrospect, the Jekyll subplot reads as the production's most obvious miscalculation, a bid for franchise legitimacy that instead became the clearest evidence of its creative bankruptcy. Future franchise builders would do well to study this failure and learn that audiences must care about the present story before they can invest in future possibilities. The film's treatment of military personnel and contemporary warfare raises uncomfortable questions about how Hollywood uses real-world conflict as backdrop for fantasy adventure without engaging with actual consequences. Nick and Chris are introduced as soldiers whose primary military function appears to be enabling their looting activities, a characterization that trivializes actual military service in combat zones. The Iraqi setting, still recovering from decades of war and occupation, becomes merely exotic location rather than a place with its own people, politics, and legitimate grievances. American military power is presented as largely ineffective against supernatural threats, a framing that allows the film to have its action movie cake while eating its critique of empire cake too. The soldiers who die in the initial skirmish and subsequent plane crash are treated as disposable extras, their deaths mere plot mechanics rather than events with emotional weight. Secretary of Defense, played by Courtney B. Vance, exists primarily to be shocked by supernatural revelations and then killed to demonstrate Ahmanet's power, a waste of a talented actor in a thankless role. The film never considers how the Iraq War might look from an Iraqi perspective, nor does it acknowledge that ancient Mesopotamian history belongs to modern Middle Eastern peoples. This political vacuum allows the film to use war imagery for excitement without ever confronting the reality that actual wars produce actual corpses with actual families who mourn them. Nick's status as a soldier who loots antiquities represents a particularly uncomfortable combination of military service and cultural theft, two activities that the film presents as equally casual and unproblematic. The resurrection of Chris in the film's final scene extends this trivialization of death into the supernatural realm, suggesting that even military fatalities can be undone when convenient for sequel setup. Contemporary audiences have become increasingly sensitive to how media uses military imagery, and this film's casual treatment likely contributed to its poor reception among viewers who found its politics distasteful. The contrast between the film's fantasy violence and actual violence in the Middle East creates an uncomfortable viewing experience for anyone who thinks about it for more than a moment. An examination of the film's pacing and structural choices reveals a narrative that consistently prioritizes spectacle over character development, resulting in action sequences that feel unearned and emotional beats that land with a thud. The first act moves with reasonable efficiency, establishing Ahmanet's backstory, introducing Nick and Chris, and reaching the tomb discovery within a manageable time frame. Once the action moves to London, however, the film loses narrative momentum, settling into extended sequences of exposition and setup that kill the energy generated by the plane crash. Dr. Jekyll's introductory scene, which should crackle with the electricity of a major star joining the proceedings, instead drags interminably as he explains Prodigium's history and mission in tedious detail. The middle section becomes a holding pattern, with characters moving from one London location to another while Ahmanet pursues them with varying degrees of urgency. Action sequences interrupt this drag, but fail to advance character or theme, existing as isolated set pieces rather than integral narrative components. The final confrontation in London arrives after so much wheel spinning that audience investment has already significantly diminished. Nick's transformation into Set's vessel, the film's most significant character moment, happens so quickly and with so little psychological preparation that its emotional impact registers as zero. Jenny's death, intended as the emotional climax motivating Nick's sacrifice, instead feels like another plot convenience given her imminent resurrection. The resurrection itself, occurring within minutes of her death, robs the narrative of any chance to explore grief or consequence. Chris's final resurrection extends this pattern of undoing deaths, suggesting that in this universe, no sacrifice carries permanent weight. The pacing issues reflect a production more concerned with hitting expected beats than with earning those beats through careful narrative construction. Future viewings reveal a film that plays better when one lowers expectations and simply enjoys individual sequences. But this is faint praise for a project with such obvious ambitions. A deeper exploration of the film's mythological framework reveals a syncretic approach that blends Egyptian theology with medieval European history in ways that are creative but ultimately incoherent. The dagger of Set, presumably an ancient Egyptian artifact, somehow requires a ruby that was carried to London by crusaders, creating a narrative connection between cultures that never receives thematic justification. Ahmanet's imprisonment outside Egypt, a detail borrowed from the 1999 film, raises questions about why Egyptian priests would transport their traitorous princess to a distant land rather than dealing with her within their own territory. The Crusader knights who originally took the ruby become an army of the dead serving an Egyptian princess, a cross-cultural alliance that exists purely for visual spectacle rather than meaningful synthesis. Set himself, a complex deity from a sophisticated theological system, is reduced to a generic evil presence whose only desire is physical incarnation and worldly power. The film's ancient Egypt exists in a timeless fantasy space untouched by actual history, its culture reduced to pyramids, curses, and evil gods in the manner of Hollywood tradition. Modern Egyptological scholarship has revealed the richness and complexity of ancient Egyptian religion, none of which filters into this simplified, sensationalized portrayal. The blending of Egyptian and Christian imagery during the final confrontation, with undead crusaders swarming through London, creates visual interest but thematic confusion about what exactly the film is trying to say about religion, history, or cultural conflict. Ahmanet's powers, supposedly derived from Set, operate according to rules that shift based on narrative convenience rather than internal logic. The film never decides whether its supernatural elements represent real forces in its world or merely ancient beliefs that happen to be true, a distinction that matters for world-building coherence. Future films in the cancelled Dark Universe would presumably have developed this mythology further, but their absence leaves this installment's supernatural framework feeling incomplete and arbitrary. The film's treatment of mythology thus joins its other half-developed elements, suggesting ideas that never receive the exploration they deserve. An analysis of the film's production design reveals ambitious work that frequently exceeds the screenplay's ability to utilize it effectively, creating environments rich with potential that the narrative hurries past without exploration. Ahmanet's tomb, discovered beneath Iraqi sands, represents the production design team at their most inspired, blending ancient Egyptian aesthetics with the claustrophobic horror of a burial chamber meant to contain evil for eternity. The intricate hieroglyphs covering every surface tell stories the film never pauses to read, functioning as atmosphere rather than information. Prodigium's London headquarters, housed within the Natural History Museum, offers a visually striking contrast between Victorian grandeur and cutting-edge monster hunting technology. The corridors filled with artifacts referencing other universal monsters reward attentive viewers, while simultaneously reminding everyone of the franchise ambitions that ultimately doomed the project. Dr. Jekyll's laboratory, all brass instruments and bubbling chemicals, evokes classic horror cinema while housing computers and monitoring equipment that ground the organization in the present day. The Crusader tomb beneath London, accessed through modern construction, creates visual interest through its historical layering, suggesting centuries of hidden history beneath contemporary streets. Modern London locations, from foggy alleys to corporate boardrooms, receive less distinctive treatment, functioning as generic backdrops rather than characters in their own right. The plain interior during the crash sequence demonstrates the production's commitment to practical sets, creating a tangible environment that enhances the sequence's visceral impact. Ahmanet's regenerative lair, wherever she establishes it, evolves visually to reflect her growing power, a detail that rewards careful viewing. The final confrontation's London streets, overrun with sand and skeletal warriors, represents the production design team's most ambitious work, transforming recognizable locations into fantasy landscapes. These environments, individually impressive, never quite cohere into a unified visual world, reflecting the film's broader inability to commit to a single aesthetic vision. The production design thus joins the film's other elements in demonstrating technical proficiency that serves an ultimately unsatisfying whole. A critical examination of the film's dialogue reveals writing that alternates between functional exposition and attempts at wit that consistently miss their mark, leaving actors struggling to sell lines that no performance could elevate. Nick Morton's dialogue attempts to establish him as a roguish adventurer in the Indiana Jones tradition, but the writing lacks the wit and specificity that made similar characters in better films feel charming rather than merely glib. Jenny Halsey's lines consist largely of archaeological exposition and reactions to Nick's behavior, giving Annabelle Wallis little to work with in establishing her character's interiority. Chris Vail's comedic dialogue, while welcome relief from the film's generally dour tone, relies on generic sarcasm rather than character-specific humor that might have made his death feel more impactful. Dr. Jekyll's speeches about Prodigium and the Dark Universe represent the film at its most leaden, burdening Russell Crowe with paragraphs of exposition that no performance could render compelling. Ahmanet's dialogue, limited by character design that restricts her speech, nonetheless achieves moments of menacing poetry that suggest what a better screenplay might have provided. The romantic exchanges between Nick and Jenny lack any distinctive voice, reading as generic attraction rather than the rekindling of a specific history. Action movie one-liners, deployed at moments meant to diffuse tension, land with the thud of obligation rather than the crackle of genuine wit. The ghostly appearances of Chris Vail provide some of the film's more successful dialogue moments, Jake Johnson's delivery adding personality to lines that on paper seem merely functional. Exposition about Egyptian mythology and Set's powers arrives in chunks, rather than being woven organically into character interaction. The film's attempts at philosophical depth, generally placed in Dr. Jekyll's mouth, feel bolted on rather than emerging naturally from the story's concerns. Future screenwriters studying this film might learn valuable lessons about the importance of distinctive character voices and the dangers of treating dialogue as mere plot delivery mechanism. The finished film demonstrates that even talented actors cannot transcend writing that gives them nothing uniquely human to say. An exploration of the film's treatment of death and resurrection reveals a troubling pattern in which mortality becomes merely another obstacle for heroes to overcome rather than a meaningful element of human experience. Chris Vail's death, initially presented as a tragic consequence of Ahmanet's curse and Nick's desperate choice, loses its weight when Chris returns as a ghost and eventually as a fully resurrected human being. Jenny's death, occurring at the moment of Nick's greatest despair, should represent the ultimate cost of Ahmanet's evil and the catalyst for Nick's transformation, yet her immediate resurrection renders this sacrifice meaningless. The soldiers and civilians who die throughout the film never receive similar consideration, their deaths treated as acceptable collateral damage in a conflict between supernatural beings. Ahmanet's original mummification, presented as the ultimate punishment for her crimes, becomes merely a temporary inconvenience that she overcomes through supernatural power. Set's promise of eternal life to those who serve him represents the film's only sustained engagement with death as a concept, and even this is treated as simple villain motivation rather than philosophical exploration. The film's climax, in which Nick gains the power of life and death over others, positions him as a godlike figure whose relationship to mortality transcends human limitation. This elevation of the hero to supernatural status undercuts any remaining sense that his choices carry real weight or consequence. The final scene, with Nick resurrecting Chris in the desert, suggests a future in which death has been completely conquered, at least for the characters we care about. This casual attitude toward resurrection reflects broader trends in franchise filmmaking, where character deaths become dramatic beats rather than permanent changes because future installments might require any character's return. The contrast with classic Universal monster movies, in which death carried genuine weight and horror, could not be more stark. This film's treatment of mortality thus joins its other elements in demonstrating how franchise thinking can drain fundamental human experiences of their meaning. An analysis of the film's place within Tom Cruise's broader career reveals fascinating tensions between his established star persona and the material's demands, tensions that the film never successfully resolves. Cruise built his career on playing clear heroes whose moral certainty matches their physical capability, characters who know exactly who they are and what they must do. Nick Morton, by contrast, begins as a morally ambiguous looter whose selfishness directly causes much of the film's conflict, a characterization that requires Cruise to play against type in ways that feel uncomfortable for both actor and audience. The film's attempts to transform Nick into a sacrificial hero feel rushed and unconvincing precisely because Cruise's natural screen presence resists the selfishness the early scenes require. His famous commitment to practical stunts, on full display in the plane crash sequence, reminds viewers of the Cruise they know and expect, creating cognitive dissonance when the character behaves in ways that Cruise's heroes typically avoid. The romantic subplot with Jenny suffers from this same dissonance, as Cruise's chemistry with Wallace never quite ignites, perhaps because the character's earlier treatment of her makes later devotion feel unearned. Cruise's producing influence presumably shaped the film's action priorities, yet even these sequences feel less distinctive than his work in the Mission Impossible franchise, where stunts serve clearly defined characters and narratives. The film's ending, which positions Nick as a supernatural anti-hero embarking on new adventures, suggests a new direction for Cruise's career that never materialized, perhaps because audiences rejected this version of him. In retrospect, this film represents one of the few instances where Cruise's star power proved insufficient to overcome fundamental creative problems, a reminder that even the most bankable actors need material suited to their gifts. The contrast between Cruise's intense professionalism and the film's creative chaos becomes visible in every scene, creating an unintentional documentary about a star trying to elevate material beneath his talents. Future Cruise vehicles would learn from this failure, returning to the clearly defined heroic roles that made him a star rather than attempting uncomfortable character complexity. This film thus stands as an anomaly in an otherwise carefully managed career, an experiment in stretching that failed and was wisely abandoned. A deeper examination of the film's soundstage and location photography reveals a production caught between the authenticity of on-location shooting and the control of studio work, resulting in a visual experience that feels neither grounded nor fully fantastic. The Iraqi desert sequences, actually filmed in Surrey and on soundstages, achieve a certain visual coherence, but lack the specific texture of actual Middle Eastern locations. London exterior photography captures recognizable landmarks, while carefully avoiding the city's contemporary diversity and energy, presenting a postcard version rather than a living city. Prodigium's interiors, constructed on soundstages, benefit from the controlled lighting and camera access that studio work enables, while suffering from the slightly artificial quality that plagues even the best soundstage construction. The plane crash sequence, filmed on a purpose-built set that could rotate and separate, represents the production's most successful integration of practical construction and digital enhancement. Natural lighting in exterior scenes, when allowed to function, creates moments of visual authenticity that contrast jarringly with the film's more heavily stylized sequences. The color grading applied throughout post-production attempts to create visual consistency across these disparate shooting environments, but instead flattens whatever distinctive qualities each location originally possessed. The Crusader Tomb set, constructed beneath London, achieves a convincing subterranean atmosphere through careful lighting and production design that hides its soundstage origins. Modern London office interiors, likely filmed on location, feel more grounded than their soundstage counterparts but lack the visual interest that designed environments provide. The final confrontation's London street scenes, shot on backlots with extensive digital extension, achieve the desired epic scale while sacrificing the specific texture of actual urban environments. This visual inconsistency mirrors the film's broader identity crisis, never committing fully to either grounded realism or stylized fantasy. The production's logistical challenges, including coordinating Cruise's schedule with complex stunt requirements, left visual compromises visible to attentive viewers. Future productions might learn from this film that visual coherence requires creative choices made early and maintained consistently, not imposed during post-production. An analysis of the film's marketing campaign reveals a fascinating case study in how studios sell products they don't fully understand, promising experiences the finished film cannot deliver. Early trailers emphasized the dark universe branding, introducing Russell Crowe's Dr. Jekyll as the connective tissue linking this film to future installments. Tom Cruise's presence dominated marketing materials, as expected, with his running silhouette becoming the campaign's most recognizable visual shorthand. The plane crash sequence featured prominently, showcasing the practical stunt work that represented the production's most obvious selling point. Sofia Boutella's Ahmanet received less emphasis in early marketing, a telling choice that prioritized star power over the film's most interesting element. Later trailers shifted focus toward horror elements, attempting to attract audiences who might otherwise dismiss the film as generic action fare. The Dark Universe logo, prominently displayed, reminded viewers of franchise ambitions that many would later cite as the film's fundamental flaw. International marketing campaigns varied significantly, with some territories emphasizing Cruise's star power, while others leaned into the monster movie heritage. The film's poster, featuring Cruise surrounded by supernatural imagery, promised an adventure that placed its star at the center of fantastic events. Social media campaigns attempted to build excitement through behind-the-scenes content, showcasing the practical effects and stunt work that represented genuine achievements. The marketing's inability to settle on a consistent message reflected the film's own identity crisis, promising something for everyone while delivering satisfaction to no one. Advance buzz from early screenings, when it leaked, suggested trouble ahead, yet the studio pressed forward with an expensive campaign designed to maximize opening weekend performance. In retrospect, the marketing campaign functioned as unintentional honesty, revealing through its contradictions the creative confusion at the project's heart. Future franchise launches would do well to study how this campaign's mixed messages signaled deeper problems that critical and commercial reception would soon confirm. An exploration of the film's supporting characters reveals a world populated by archetypes rather than people, figures whose existence serves the plot without ever suggesting lives beyond their narrative function. Courtney B., Vance's Secretary of Defense, arrives with presidential authority and departs via Ahmanet's violence, his character existing solely to establish stakes and then demonstrate villainous power. The various soldiers and scientists populating Prodigium's facility receive neither names nor distinguishing characteristics, remaining interchangeable background figures. Chris Vale's transformation from comic relief sidekick to possessed victim to ghostly conscience represents the film's most ambitious supporting arc. Yet even this plays as collection of types rather than coherent character development. The Egyptian workers who first encounter Ahmanet's tomb exist purely as discoverers and victims, their cultural connection to the site never acknowledged. London police and military forces appear as generic responders, their inevitable failure demonstrating supernatural threat without requiring characterization. The flight crew on Nick's ill-fated plane received just enough screen time to die, their deaths contributing to the sequence's chaos without earning emotional response. Prodigium's various monster hunters, glimpsed in background shots, suggest a larger organization that the film never bothers to populate with actual people. The Crusader Knights, even after resurrection as Ahmanet's army, remain visual effects rather than characters, their individual histories irrelevant to their function as army. This approach to supporting characters, common in franchise filmmaking, reflects a calculation that audiences only need to invest in protagonists and villains. Yet the best franchise films populate their worlds with memorable supporting players whose presence enriches the central narrative. This film's failure to do so leaves its world feeling thin and provisional, a stage set rather than a living environment. Future installments, had they materialized, would have faced the challenge of retrofitting personality onto characters introduced as mere furniture. A critical examination of the film's color palette and visual style reveals choices that reflect broader trends in 2010's blockbuster cinematography while failing to establish distinctive identity. The teal and orange grading that dominated the era appears throughout, particularly in action sequences where skin tones war with background colors in ways that have become predictable. Ancient Egypt sequences employ a warmer, more saturated palette intended to suggest antiquity and exoticism while remaining within contemporary commercial parameters. Prodigium's interiors default to cool blues and clinical whites, the visual language of modern institutions that has become cinematographic shorthand for secret organizations. London exteriors, when not digitally enhanced for supernatural events, adopt the desaturated look that has characterized the city's cinematic portrayal for decades. Ahmanet's design incorporates specific colors intended to read as Egyptian while remaining visually distinct from her surroundings. The dagger of Set and its ruby receive chromatic emphasis that signals their importance without achieving the iconic status such objects require. Night sequences struggle for visibility, a common problem in modern blockbusters where the desire for atmosphere battles the need for comprehensible action. The film's occasional ventures into horror imagery employ darkness and shadow in ways that suggest a more interesting visual approach that the production declined to pursue consistently. Cruise's star image requires certain lighting choices that sometimes conflict with the film's darker aspirations, creating visual compromises that satisfy neither priority. The digital intermediate process, through which all modern films receive final color correction, has here been used to create consistency rather than distinctiveness. The resulting visual experience is competent without being memorable, functional without being artistic. Future viewers seeking to understand 2010's blockbuster aesthetics might study this film as a textbook example of the era's default visual choices, executed with professional competence, but without distinguishing vision. An analysis of the film's approach to horror elements reveals a production perpetually pulling its punches, suggesting terror while ultimately retreating into safer action-adventure territory. The spider bite that begins Chris Vale's possession offers genuine body horror potential, yet the film cuts away from full transformation, leaving the most disturbing imagery to audience imagination. Ahmanet's victims, drained of life force, become desiccated corpses that suggest the horror film lurking beneath this blockbuster surface. The mummification sequence in ancient Egypt, depicting Ahmanet's living burial, achieves genuine horror through practical makeup and committed performance. Yet these moments exist in isolation, surrounded by action spectacle that operates according to completely different emotional rules. The ghostly appearances of Chris Vale borrow from horror tradition while functioning primarily as comic relief, a tonal mixture that undercuts any sustained dread. Ahmanet's pursuit of Nick through London creates stalker thriller tension that the film resolves through action rather than horror's characteristic helplessness. Prodigium's containment facility, with its imprisoned monsters and supernatural artifacts, suggests horror's fascination with forbidden knowledge and its consequences. The transformation of Dr. Jekyll into Mr. Hyde, however, abandons horror's psychological complexity for generic CGI monster fighting. Nightmare sequences, brief and underdeveloped, gesture toward horror's interest in the unconscious without committing to its exploration. The undead Crusader army, conceptually terrifying as medieval knights returned from death, function primarily as action movie obstacles rather than horror movie threats. This constant retreat from horror's implications leaves the film in generic no man's land, too scary for pure action audiences and not scary enough for horror fans. The classic Universal monster movies understood that horror requires commitment to its mood and atmosphere, a lesson this reboot failed to learn. Future monster movie productions might study this film as example of how genre hybridity can become genre confusion when executed without clear vision. An examination of the film's attempt to establish a shared universe reveals structural choices that actively damage the core narrative while failing to generate interest in future installments. The introduction of Prodigium and Dr. Jekyll occurs at the film's midpoint, grinding forward momentum to a halt for extended exposition about organizations and threats unrelated to Ahmanet's immediate danger. Artifacts referencing the Bride of Frankenstein, the Wolf Man, and other classic monsters appear in background shots, rewarding attentive viewers while distracting everyone else from the story at hand. Dr. Jekyll's dialogue explicitly references other monsters and future threats, treating this film as chapter 1 in a series rather than a complete narrative. The post-credits scene that never arrives would presumably have made these connections even more explicit, but the film's main body already functions as extended trailer for sequels. This world-building comes at the expense of character development, with Nick and Jenny receiving less attention than the franchise infrastructure surrounding them. The Dark Universe branding, appearing before the film's title, positions this story as product rather than art, a commercial proposition rather than creative statement. Russell Crowe's casting as Jekyll, announced with great fanfare, promised a star of sufficient magnitude to anchor a shared universe, yet his character's minimal connection to the main plot leaves him feeling extraneous. The film's ending, which sends Nick into the world as a supernatural being hunted by Prodigium, sets up conflicts that will never be resolved. Future audiences, watching this film after the Dark Universe's collapse, experience its franchise ambitions as poignant artifacts of failed corporate strategy. The structural damage this world-building inflicts on the core narrative serves as warning to future productions. Audiences must care about the present story before they can invest in future possibilities. Marvel's success came from making good individual films first. This film's failure came from prioritizing the universe over the movie audiences were actually watching. A deeper analysis of the film's gender politics reveals troubling patterns that extend beyond Jenny Halsey's underwritten character to encompass the film's entire treatment of female agency and power. Ahmanet's villainy stems from being denied her birthright because of her gender, a motivation that could support feminist reading, but instead becomes justification for monstrous transformation. Her powers, once acquired, manifest primarily through seduction and sexual threat, reducing her complex tragedy to function of female sexuality. Jenny's archaeological expertise, established early, becomes irrelevant once danger begins, her role shifting to victim and love interest requiring male rescue. The film's female characters exist entirely in relation to male protagonists, their stories beginning and ending with the men in their lives. Ahmanet's desire for a male consort to house Set's spirit positions her agency as dependent on male body and will. Jenny's professional accomplishments matter less than her romantic history with Nick, which the film treats as her defining characteristic. The female monster hunters glimpsed in Prodigium's background remain nameless and characterless, suggesting diversity without committing to representation. The film's treatment of ancient Egyptian queenship and power dynamics reduces complex historical realities to simple good/evil framework. Female audience members seeking characters with whom to identify will find only villain and victim, neither offering positive or complex model of womanhood. This gender trouble reflects broader industry patterns that this film, despite its ambitions, does nothing to challenge or improve. The contrast with the 1999 The Mummy, which gave Rachel Weisz's Evelyn both agency and character development, could not be more stark. Future monster movies, particularly the successful Invisible Man reboot, would demonstrate how horror can center female experience without reducing women to archetypes. This film's gender politics thus join its other elements in demonstrating what happens when franchise thinking replaces thoughtful character creation. An exploration of the film's thematic engagement with destiny and free will reveals interesting concepts that the narrative raises, but never satisfactorily resolves. Ahmanet's original sin, murdering her family to secure power, represents a choice that seals her fate, yet the film presents her as driven by forces beyond her control. Nick's destiny as Set's chosen vessel operates as prophecy that he spends the film trying to escape, raising questions about whether fate can be avoided or only fulfilled. The dagger of Set and its ruby function as tools of destiny, objects whose reunion seems fated regardless of human intervention. Dr. Jekyll's belief that Set can be controlled and studied represents Enlightenment faith in human reason overcoming supernatural forces. Jenny's death, seemingly fated by Ahmanet's plan, becomes the catalyst for Nick's free will choice to accept possession. Nick's ability to control Set's power through love suggests that human emotion can transcend supernatural programming, a hopeful message about free will's ultimate triumph. Yet the film's ending, with Nick embracing his monster identity and resurrecting Chris, suggests that destiny ultimately claims everyone regardless of their choices. The ancient Egyptian priests who imprisoned Ahmanet believed they could control fate through ritual, yet their efforts merely delayed rather than prevented her return. Prodigium's entire mission represents an attempt to impose human order on supernatural chaos, a battle against destiny that the film suggests cannot ultimately be won. This thematic richness never receives the sustained exploration it deserves, buried beneath action spectacle and franchise setup. A version of this film that took its philosophical questions seriously might have achieved the depth its aspirations suggested. Instead, these themes float through the narrative like ghosts, present but insubstantial, raising questions the film lacks interest in answering. Future viewers seeking intellectual engagement will find hints of interesting ideas without the satisfying exploration those ideas deserve. An analysis of the film's editing patterns reveals a rhythm that prioritizes coverage over coherence, cutting between angles and perspectives in ways that maintain visual interest while sacrificing spatial clarity. Action sequences, particularly the plane crash and final confrontation, employ rapid cutting that conveys chaos without allowing audiences to track character positions and spatial relationships. Dialogue scenes default to standard coverage patterns, shot-reverse-shot constructions that prioritize actor performances without adding visual interest to expository content. The transitions between London locations, accomplished through standard establishing shots and cuts, lack the stylistic flair that might have given the city visual personality. Horror moments receive slightly longer takes that allow tension to build, suggesting an editor aware of genre requirements that the director did not consistently prioritize. The film's 110-minute runtime, relatively tight by modern blockbuster standards, reflects editing choices that prioritized momentum over character development. Deleted scenes, eventually released, suggest additional material that might have addressed some of the film's character problems had it been retained. The visual effects-heavy sequences required extensive editing collaboration with effects houses, resulting in cuts determined as much by technical requirements as narrative needs. The film's MPAA rating, PG-13, influenced editing choices around violence and horror, with cuts designed to maintain accessibility for younger audiences. Cruise's stunt work receives emphasis through editing that showcases his physical commitment, sometimes at the expense of narrative flow. The final confrontation's editing prioritizes spectacle over coherence, leaving audiences uncertain about the physical logic governing supernatural combat. Future editors studying this film might learn valuable lessons about the importance of establishing spatial relationships before cutting for coverage. The film's editing, like its other elements, demonstrates professional competence without achieving the distinctive rhythm that separates memorable films from forgettable ones. A critical examination of the film's attempts at humor reveals a consistent misfire between comic intent and comic execution, with jokes landing awkwardly in scenes requiring different tonal registers. Chris Vail's sarcastic commentary, intended as relief from supernatural horror, instead undermines tension that the film has worked to establish. Nick's one-liners, delivered with Cruise's characteristic intensity, read as character breaking the fourth wall rather than organic expressions of personality. The ghostly Vail's continued presence provides opportunities for humor that the film exploits inconsistently, sometimes playing his appearances for laughs and other times for pathos. Dr. Jekyll's attempts at wit fall flat because his character lacks the warmth that would make humor feel natural rather than forced. Jenny and Nick's banter, intended to suggest romantic chemistry, instead reveals the absence of genuine connection between their characters. The film's darkest moments, including Chris's death and Jenny's apparent demise, are followed so quickly by comic relief that neither tone lands effectively. Ahmanet's menace, carefully constructed through Botella's performance, dissipates when the film cuts to quips that treat her threat as less than fully serious. The undead crusaders, conceptually terrifying, become slightly ridiculous when treated as obstacles for comic action rather than horror threats. Prodigium's monster hunters, glimpsed briefly, never achieve the personality that would make comic relief feel earned rather than imposed. This tonal confusion reflects the film's broader uncertainty about what kind of experience it wants to provide audiences. The classic Universal monster movies understood that horror and humor require careful calibration, a lesson this reboot fails to learn. Future monster films would do well to study how the Brendan Fraser Mummy movies balance scares and laughs through consistent character comedy rather than genre interruption. This film's humor, like its horror, suffers from the production's inability to commit fully to any single creative vision. An examination of the film's approach to its source material reveals a relationship characterized by simultaneous reverence and dismissal, honoring classic elements while fundamentally misunderstanding what made them work. The original 1932 The Mummy achieved its power through atmospheric dread and Boris Karloff's tragic performance, elements this reboot acknowledges without successfully replicating. The Brendan Fraser films succeeded through adventure comedy balance and genuine character chemistry, qualities this film lacks despite obvious attempts to channel their spirit. Ahmanet's design incorporates visual elements from multiple mummy traditions while establishing distinctive identity, one of the film's more successful engagements with its heritage. The Dagger of Set functions as MacGuffin in the tradition of adventure cinema, yet lacks the specific resonance that similar objects achieve in better films. Prodigium's monster collection directly references Universal's classic characters, treating them as intellectual property rather than sources of creative inspiration. Dr. Jekyll's inclusion, forced and extraneous, demonstrates the production's misunderstanding of why shared universes work. Audiences must love individual characters before craving their intersection. The film's Egyptian setting, obligatory for mummy stories, functions as exotic backdrop rather than culturally specific environment. The romantic subplot, central to both 1932 and 1999 versions, lacks the chemistry that made previous iterations compelling. Nick Morton's roguish adventurer draws on Indiana Jones and Rick O'Connell without achieving the specific personality that made those characters beloved. Ahmanet's tragic dimension, borrowed from Karloff's original portrayal, gets lost amidst action spectacle and franchise obligations. This complicated relationship with source material leaves the film pleasing neither traditionalists seeking classic horror nor audiences wanting fresh take. The production's reverence for its heritage manifests in surface details rather than structural understanding of what made previous versions work. Future reboots might learn that honoring source material requires understanding its essence, not merely referencing its iconography. This film's engagement with its predecessors thus joins its other elements in demonstrating competence without comprehension. An analysis of the film's soundstage work reveals the particular challenges of creating convincing environments for supernatural events while maintaining visual coherence with location photography. The Prodigium sets, constructed on soundstages, achieve impressive scale while benefiting from controlled lighting that enhances their institutional aesthetic. The ancient Egyptian sequences, filmed on standing sets modified for this production, create convincing antiquity through production design that hides their constructed nature. The plane crash set, a marvel of practical engineering, represents soundstage work at its most ambitious, creating a rotating environment that allowed genuine zero-gravity filming. Yet this set's artificiality becomes visible in wider shots, where digital extension reveals the soundstage boundaries that practical construction cannot escape. The Crusader tomb set, built on a soundstage, achieves subterranean authenticity through lighting and texture work that hides its above-ground location. London street scenes, shot on backlots, create convincing urban environments while allowing control impossible in actual locations. The blending of soundstage and location footage, seamless in moments, reveals its seams in others, creating visual discontinuity that attentive viewers notice. Soundstage work permits the controlled conditions necessary for complex stunt sequences, explaining why so much of the film's action occurs in constructed environments. The temperature and weather control possible on soundstages also protects actors and equipment, practical considerations that influence creative decisions. Yet the best films make their soundstage work invisible, creating environments that feel as real as any location. This film's constructed environments, impressive individually, never quite achieve the organic unity that would make them feel like parts of a coherent world. The soundstage work thus joins the film's other elements in demonstrating technical proficiency that serves an ultimately unsatisfying whole. Future productions might study this film to understand the importance of visual consistency across all environments, whether constructed or real. An exploration of the film's approach to monster mythology reveals a tension between creating new lore and honoring established traditions, a balance that the production never quite achieves. Ahmanet's origin as betrayed princess adds tragic dimension missing from simpler monster portrayals, representing genuine innovation in mummy mythology. The set connection, linking Ahmanet's power to a major Egyptian deity, expands the mythological framework beyond previous films. Yet this new mythology exists alongside references to other universal monsters, creating crowded mythological space without establishing clear relationships between supernatural elements. The rules governing Ahmanet's powers, established inconsistently, prevent audiences from understanding what she can and cannot do. Prodigium's monster classification system, glimpsed briefly, suggests organized approach to supernatural threat that the film never fully explains. Dr. Jekyll's condition, caused by potion rather than supernatural origin, exists uneasily alongside Ahmanet's genuinely magical abilities. The undead crusaders, created by Ahmanet's power, raise questions about whether she can animate any dead or only those with historical connection to her dagger. Nick's transformation into Set's vessel introduces new rules about possession and control that the film establishes only to immediately complicate. The resurrection of Jenny and Chris, accomplished through Set's power, suggests capabilities that make subsequent threats seem less dangerous. This mythological inconsistency reflects the film's broader failure to establish clear rules for its supernatural world. The best monster movies create systems that audiences can understand and anticipate, building tension through consistent application of established rules. This film's mythology, by contrast, shifts according to narrative convenience, preventing the coherent world-building essential to franchise success. Future monster films might study this failure to understand that mythology requires consistent rules before it can support sustained storytelling. An analysis of the film's visual effects reveals particular challenges in rendering supernatural beings who must interact believably with practical environments and human actors. Ahmanet's transformations, among the film's most frequent visual effects sequences, achieve best results when blending practical makeup with digital enhancement rather than relying entirely on CGI. The skeletal crusaders, fully digital creations, lack the physical weight that would make them feel present in London streets. Sandstorm sequences, digital in their entirety, achieve scale without the tactile menace that practical sand effects might have provided. Mr. Hyde's CGI form, the film's most criticized visual effect, demonstrates the limitations of digital character creation when unmoored from practical reference. The crows that attack the plane, digital flocks, achieve convincing movement patterns while lacking the specific menace of trained animal performers. Set's manifestation during Nick's possession, glimpsed briefly, suggests a more interesting monster design that the film never fully reveals. The dagger of Set and its ruby, primarily practical props, receive digital enhancement that makes them glow without losing physical presence. London's destruction during the final confrontation, entirely digital, achieves scale without the emotional impact that practical destruction might have carried. Ahmanet's life-drain victims, desiccated through digital effects, achieve horror without requiring the elaborate practical makeup that would have served same function. The blending of practical and digital effects, seamless in some sequences, reveals its seams in others, creating uneven viewing experience. The film's visual effects budget, reportedly substantial, produced results that vary widely in quality, suggesting challenges in effects supervision and vendor coordination. Future productions might learn that consistent quality requires clear creative vision communicated effectively across all effects houses. This film's visual effects, like its other elements, demonstrate ambition exceeding execution, resulting in work that impresses in moments while disappointing in others. A critical examination of the film's pacing in its middle section reveals particular problems that stem from the production's need to establish franchise infrastructure while advancing core narrative. The Prodigium sequence, running nearly 20 minutes, halts momentum established by the plane crash and London chase. Extended exposition about the Dark Universe and Prodigium's mission prioritizes future installments over present engagement. Dr. Jekyll's demonstration of Hyde transformation, while visually striking, exists outside the main plot's concerns. Nick and Jenny's interactions during this section, meant to develop their relationship, instead reveal the chemistry their characters lack. Ahmanet's absence during these sequences diminishes her threat, making subsequent reappearance feel less urgent. The plan to allow Set's possession in controlled environment, discussed at length, raises logical questions that distract from narrative engagement. Jekyll's internal struggle with Hyde, introduced here, adds character dimension that the film lacks time to develop properly. The artifacts glimpsed throughout Prodigium, referencing other monsters, remind audiences of franchise ambitions rather than deepening this story. Cruise's star presence, always compelling, cannot compensate for narrative drift that leaves his character without clear objective. The sequence's conclusion, with Ahmanet's escape, finally restores momentum after significant delay. Yet the damage to pacing has already occurred, leaving the film's final act to overcome audience disengagement. Future franchise launches might learn that world building must serve current story rather than compete with it for attention. This film's middle section stands as monument to what happens when corporate ambition overrides narrative priorities, demonstrating that audiences must care about present before they can invest in future. An analysis of the film's costuming reveals work that frequently exceeds the screenplay's ability to utilize it, creating visual interest that the narrative fails to support. Ahmanet's costumes evolve throughout the film, reflecting her growing power through increasingly elaborate design. The ancient Egyptian costumes, researched and designed with apparent care, create convincing antiquity while serving character needs. Modern character costumes, by contrast, lack distinction, dressing heroes and villains in generic contemporary clothing. Prodigium's uniforms, intended to suggest paramilitary organization, achieve functional anonymity without memorable design elements. The dagger of Set, designed as significant artifact, achieves visual distinctiveness that its plot function never quite justifies. Nick's transformation into Set's vessel requires costume changes that signal his changing nature without fully committing to monster design. The undead crusaders, armored and decayed, create striking visual through combination of period costume and horror makeup. Dr. Jekyll's Victorian-influenced modern dress suggests his antique origins without becoming costume-y or distracting. Jenny's archaeological field, where practical and unremarkable, reflects her character's prioritization of function over fashion. The film's color palette, established through costume as much as cinematography, achieves coherence in some sequences while fragmenting in others. Costume design often functions as silent storytelling, revealing character through clothing choices that audiences absorb unconsciously. This film's costume work, strongest in its supernatural elements, demonstrates what thoughtful design can achieve when supported by narrative attention. Yet even the best costumes cannot compensate for characters whose interior lives remain unexplored. Future productions might study how this film's visual design occasionally exceeds its writing, demonstrating the importance of balanced attention across all creative departments. An exploration of the film's treatment of ancient magic reveals a system that operates according to convenience rather than consistent rules, undermining the world-building essential to fantasy storytelling. Ahmanet's powers, derived from Set, allow her to control animals, drain life force, and command the dead, abilities that expand or contract based on narrative need. The dagger of Set, required for her original ritual, becomes necessary again for Set's full incarnation. Yet the film never explains why the same tool serves both purposes. The ruby, separated from dagger for centuries, retains power despite its isolation, suggesting magic that transcends physical proximity. Ahmanet's mummification, intended to contain her forever, fails because her power survives bodily death, raising questions about why Egyptian priests thought their methods would work. The curse binding Nick to Ahmanet operates through dream visitations, supernatural awareness, and ghostly messengers, a haphazard collection of effects rather than coherent system. Set's power, transferred to Nick through self-stabbing, somehow includes resurrection ability that Ahmanet never demonstrated. The undead crusaders, once animated, follow Ahmanet's commands without apparent limit on numbers or duration. Magic's interaction with modern technology, glimpsed during plane crash and London sequences, suggests rules that the film never bothers to explain. This magical inconsistency prevents audiences from understanding what supernatural events mean within the film's world. The best fantasy establishes rules that create suspense through audience understanding of what characters can and cannot do. This film's magic, by contrast, serves whatever purpose the scene requires, eliminating the predictability that makes supernatural conflict dramatically engaging. Future fantasy productions might study this failure to understand that even magic requires consistent logic. The film's magical system thus joins its other elements in demonstrating the importance of coherent world building for narrative engagement. An analysis of the film's relationship to contemporary politics reveals unconscious reflection of its historical moment rather than deliberate engagement with current events. The Iraqi setting, chosen for exotic adventure rather than political commentary, nonetheless evokes ongoing American military involvement in the Middle East. Nick and Chris's status as soldiers who loot antiquities uncomfortably echoes actual stories of archaeological looting during Iraq War chaos. The film's treatment of Middle Eastern cultures as backdrop for Western adventure reflects Orientalist patterns with long colonial history. Prodigium's secret organization, operating outside governmental oversight, mirrors anxieties about shadowy power structures that characterize 2010's political discourse. Dr. Jekyll's ambiguous morality, simultaneously monster hunter and monster himself, reflects era's distrust of institutional authority. Ahmanet's rage at being denied power because of gender, while situated in ancient Egypt, echoes contemporary feminist movements demanding recognition and equality. The film's complete erasure of modern Egyptian people, however, undermines any progressive reading of its gender politics. London's destruction by supernatural forces, while purely fantastic, evokes era's anxiety about terrorism and urban vulnerability. The Crusader army, medieval European knights serving Egyptian princess, creates uncomfortable imagery of religious warfare without engaging its implications. Nick's transformation into powerful being who operates outside law reflects fantasies of individual agency in era of perceived institutional failure. These political resonances, unconscious rather than deliberate, reveal the film's absorption of its cultural moment without critical engagement. A more thoughtful production might have explored these themes deliberately, using fantasy to examine contemporary concerns. Instead, they float through the narrative as unintended echoes, revealing more about filmmakers' assumptions than their intentions. Future viewers may find this unconscious political content more interesting than anything the film deliberately attempted, a common fate for works that fail to control their own meanings. An examination of the film's use of London as setting reveals choices that prioritize iconic imagery over atmospheric specificity, using the city as postcard rather than character. Big Ben, the Thames, and other landmarks appear in establishing shots that announce location without exploring its possibilities. The foggy London streets, obligatory for Gothic horror, function as atmosphere rather than environment with specific character. Prodigium's location within the Natural History Museum uses iconic building without engaging its history or meaning. The Crusader tomb beneath London, discovered through modern construction, suggests hidden history that the film never explores. London's diverse population, invisible throughout, might have provided contrast to supernatural threat that the film ignores. The city's layered history, from Roman foundations through medieval period to present, could have supported richer engagement with ancient evil invading modern space. Instead, London functions as generic Western city, interchangeable with any other location. The film's London sequences, shot primarily on soundstages and backlots, lack the specific texture that location shooting might have provided. Night photography, heavily stylized, further distances the city from its actual character. The final confrontation's London streets, overrun with sand and skeletons, achieve epic scale while losing any connection to real place. This treatment of London reflects broader tendency to use locations as backdrops rather than environments that shape narrative and character. The best London set films capture the city's specific character, using its geography and atmosphere to enhance story. This film's London, by contrast, could be any city with recognizable landmarks, losing the specificity that might have grounded its fantasy. Future productions might learn that location requires engagement, not merely identification, to contribute meaningfully to narrative. An analysis of the film's approach to its PG-13 rating reveals a production constantly negotiating between the horror its material suggests and the accessibility its budget requires. The life-drain sequences, conceptually horrific, minimize gore through editing and effect choices that satisfy rating requirements. Chris Vale's spider-bite possession, potentially terrifying, cuts away from full transformation to maintain accessibility. Ahmanet's murders, frequent throughout, occur largely off-screen or in stylized presentation that reduces visceral impact. The undead crusaders, skeletons with remaining flesh, achieve horror imagery without crossing into graphic territory. Mr. Hyde's violence, during brief appearance, prioritizes chaotic action over detailed injury depiction. The plane crash sequence, intense and chaotic, kills numerous characters without dwelling on their deaths. Jenny's apparent death, emotional climax, occurs through violence that the film presents stylistically rather than graphically. Nick's self-stabbing with the dagger, central plot point, minimizes blood and wound detail to maintain rating. The ancient mummification sequence, potentially the film's most disturbing content, presents horror through implication rather than explicit depiction. This constant negotiation with rating requirements leaves the film feeling compromised, never quite achieving the intensity its material deserves. The classic Universal monster movies, made before rating systems, achieved horror through atmosphere rather than gore, a lesson this film fails to learn. PG-13 horror can be effective when it builds dread rather than depending on graphic depiction. This film's horror, by contrast, feels like a watered-down version of something more intense, pleasing neither audiences seeking scares nor those avoiding them. The rating negotiation thus joins the film's other compromises in producing a result that satisfies no one fully.